Hello and welcome to the Unit 3 lecture on Prehistoric and Egyptian Architecture. Before you begin, you should have already read Chapter 1 in the Buildings Across Time book, the chapter titled The Beginnings of Architecture. This lecture is meant simply as a supplement to the information contained in the reading for Chapter 1. You will be tested on things from the reading that are not covered in this lecture. When you're ready to begin, please advance to the next slide. Be sure to click on the audio icon to hear the audio content that accompanies each slide. Unlike other civilizations that we've studied up until now, the Minoans were isolated. They were bounded by the sea. Minoan culture was located on the island of Crete. As you can see in the map on the upper left, Crete is the island at the bottom in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Because of this, the Minoans developed into a sea trading power. They created a rich civilization with a luxurious and relaxed way of life. The Minoan religion was much less formal than that of the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, and their religion centered around landscape rituals. These rituals often included processions to cave sanctuaries built within the landscape. So because of this, the Minoans did not build temples like we saw the Egyptians. Rather, their civilization focused on the building of palaces. These palaces were the center of economic and political culture within Minoan society. They often included forums for gathering, storage for crops, workshops for artists. They would occupy low hills for strategic reasons. And they were complex, often organized around a central courtyard, many times resembling a labyrinth. In other words, they were maze-like in their organization. The Palace of Minos, which is located in Knossos in Crete and dates from 1700 BC, is really the paradigm of the Minoan palaces. This particular palace is also related to the Daedalus legend. In Greek mythology, the Minotaur was a creature that was part man and part bull. It dwelt at the center of a labyrinth, which was an elaborate maze-like construction built for King Minos of Crete, and designed by the architect Daedalus and his son Icarus, who were ordered to build it to hold the Minotaur. This historical site at Knossos is usually identified as the site of the labyrinth in Greek mythology. Minotaur is also Greek, meaning bull of Minos. So the palace was a place that was a real place, but also a place that was identified in Greek mythology. The Palace of Minos was a large multi-storied complex, only the ground floor of which remains today. And you can see from the floor plans at the top how this was really a maze-like composition of forms. Certain aspects of the palace have been impossible to reconstruct, for sure, what their functions were used for. But we know that there were areas for storage of surplus, residential areas, workshop for artisans, and the like. It was a large palace, over 20,000 square meters, functionally arranged. All the functions were gathered around a large courtyard in the center, which was used as an organizing element. The palace itself was picturesque, colorful, and created an atmosphere of comfort and informality, which is very unlike the monumentality of the pyramids and the ziggurats we saw in the previous unit. All the spaces in the Palace of Minos focused on the central courtyard. In this case, the courtyard is oriented pointing towards the sacred mountain, Mount Jutkus, which is the site of one of the most important cave sanctuaries within the landscape. The courtyard also may have been used for communal gatherings and ceremonies, which would include bull-jumping rituals, where spectators could watch from the balconies that surrounded the courtyard as the ceremony took place. On this side, you can see a number of images of the fragments that remain from the Palace of Minos. The two images on the right of the slide are important because they show the typical Minoan column, which is one of the most identifiable pieces of architecture in Minoan architecture. The Minoan columns were unique because they had this inverted, tapered shaft, which was often painted red, and these kind of blue, bulbous pillow capitals. They're one of the most unique and identifiable aspects in typical Minoan architecture. So if we look at this palace in terms of form, site, and meaning, the way we typically are evaluating architecture in this class, in terms of form, this is a large palace complex that was irregularly organized. The spaces focused on a central courtyard. It was multi-storied. You can find Minoan columns, systems for irrigation, drainage, light wells, air circulation. To get to the palace, it was a circuitous approach, and they used various types of stone building techniques, including large corner blocks for the cornerstones and fired bricks and rubble stones for infill. In terms of site, it's located on Knossos on the island of Crete. It's on a hilltop location, built in the Middle to Late Bronze Age. It's on the site of a previous settlement, and it's focused around a courtyard which is aligned toward Mount Juctus. In terms of meaning, it's the center of political and economic authority. This was a society that was a hierarchical and authoritarian society, and the courtyards may have been used for ceremonial bull jumping rituals. Mycenaean architecture refers to early Greek architecture, which would typically have been found on what would later become the Greek mainland. And it's a precursor to Greek culture. The Mycenaeans were a society of warriors. They were also traders, but they were not peaceful like the Minoans. And unlike the Minoans, they weren't surrounded by water. So Minoan culture was much more casual, laid back, and isolated. For the Mycenaean culture, this was really the age of heroes, with warrior kings and fortified cities and palaces. They adopted the idea of palace building from the Minoans, but these weren't pleasure palaces with their laid-back atmosphere like in Minoan architecture. Mycenaean architecture is really that of fortified citadels. Mycenaean architecture is also important for the development of the Megaron, or Great Hall. The Megaron would have been the focus of a typical palace structure, typically centrally located, and it was the principal residence for royalty. It's essentially a large or an enlarged version of a typical house with a hearth. And in Mycenaean architecture, it becomes kind of a glorified throne room. The Mycenaean Megaron is important because it is the precursor to what becomes the Greek temple form. And obviously the Greek temple is one of the fundamental pieces of architecture in the course of Western architectural history. The citadel of Mycenae, which dates from 1250 BC, is typical of a fortified Mycenaean palace. Mycenae was a large and powerful city-state, and this would have been the largest of the Mycenaean palaces. All of the essential government functions would have occurred within the walls of the citadel, while the population and all of the agricultural activities would have occurred outside of the walls. The citadel is guarded by the famous Lion's Gate. The construction is often referred to as Cyclopean masonry, which is named for the seemingly human strength-defying size and composition of the enormous boulders that are used for the exterior walls of the citadel. The walls were extremely large and defensive in nature. In some cases they were up to 20 feet in thickness, and their original height is unknown. Everything about the citadel is defensive in nature, from the approach in terms of how you get to the citadel, the gate, as well as the site being located on a defensive hilltop position. So when we look at the citadel in terms of form, site, and meaning, its form, it was a defensive citadel. The gates and the roads were all organized to constrain an attack. It was the center of government, a walled and gated city. The focus of the citadel itself would have been on the Megaron, which would have occurred in the center, which again was based on the typical house form enlarged to become a throne room for the king. The population in the fields and the agriculture would have occurred outside of the walls, and the citadel itself was guarded by the Lion's Gate, and known for its use of large stones, often called Cyclopean masonry. The site It's located on a hilltop site with views of the plains below. It's a site complex that includes not only the citadel, but a number of tombs and other structures outside of the walls. And it would have occurred during the Late Bronze Age. And its meaning, it's a city that's protected by the goddess Lion Gate, which the citadel of Mycenae is famous for. It represents a centralized government that was prosperous, and it's also a defensive structure. Outside of the walls of the citadel of Mycenae, you'll find the treasury of Atreus, which dates from 1250 BC. The Mycenaeans were known for their tholos, or beehive tombs. And beginning in the Late Bronze Age, kings would be buried outside of the city walls. This is a tomb on a monumental scale, and because of its monumentality, it's a symbol of wealth and power. And it represents the highest quality of stone cutting and proportional refinement that we see in Mycenaean architecture. If you look at the section on the top of this slide, you can see where these tombs get their beehive moniker from, due to the shape of the dome. This is perhaps the most spectacular aspect of the treasury of Atreus, is this interior space. It's a massive interior space with a circular plan that's about 48 feet in diameter and 44 feet high. There would have been a rectangular burial chamber adjacent to the central space. The dome itself is made from a brick technique which is called corbelling, where each row of bricks is moved in ever so slightly from the row below it. And the result is you get this kind of beehive or pointed domed shaped space. This space has 33 corbelled rings which composes the roof structure, and is probably the most magnificent aspect of the typical tholos or beehive tombs that Mycenaean architecture is known for. There is perhaps no other time period in the history of Western architecture more important than ancient Greece. Really, the course of Western architectural history has been dominated by the influence and the achievements of the ancient Greeks. Even today, the term classical architecture conjures up images of the architecture of ancient Greece. It is the absolute most important time period in Western architectural history. Unlike the Egyptians, who focused on preparing themselves for the afterlife, the Greeks believed that immortality was attained through achievement, that excellent deeds would be recorded and remembered forever. Greek culture is known as being humanistic, or human-centered. In other words, it's concerned with human affairs, the nature or values of humans. Greek architecture represents the search for the ideal. Greek culture sought the ideal in perfect balance, physical, intellectual, social, and artistic. This spirit of thinking produced great philosophers and thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle, Hippocrates, Euclid, and Pythagoras. Greek mathematical achievements are still commonly used today. The Greek religion focused on the heroic, when people went beyond their natural limits. And gods in Greek mythology were often godlike humans. Greek gods even take on this type of human quality in some cases. Unlike other cultures we've studied, there was no kings. Ancient Greece is a republic. And one of the most important things that we've gained from ancient Greece is a kind of first form of democracy. Ancient Greece was a government of men, not of kings or gods. And Greek life really revolved around the city-state, or polis. Greek architecture begins to reflect this emphasis in civic life with new forms of civic or public architecture. There are two fundamental principles of Greek architecture and Greek culture that are important. The first is humanism, and the second one is the search for the ideal. In terms of humanism, humanism was created by the sophists, which were a class of teachers who in the 5th century originated the idea of humanism as a cultural education program. It was aimed at the many-sided development of man's faculties and the creation of the highest excellence of which he was capable. In other words, for Greek culture, man is the measure of all things. Even Greek gods look and act like men. Greek religion focuses on the heroic, when people go beyond their natural limits and become godlike. The second important aspect of Greek culture is the search for the ideal, or the idea of idealized beauty. The Greeks were interested in achieving kind of perfect balance of the physical, spiritual, artistic, intellectual, and social aspects of life, and that beauty or perfection were only achieved when this balance between all these things occurred. In terms of Greek architecture, we also tend to look at the idea of mathematical beauty. Proportions, numbers, ratios all contribute to the aspect of this idealized mathematical perfection in Greek architecture. In other words, in Greek architecture, beauty lies in the subtle mathematical refinements that we'll see in many of the projects. On this side, you'll see the Temple of Hera II, sometimes called the Temple of Poseidon. This is a classical Greek or Doric temple located in Paestum, Italy. This is an example of architecture that is meant to be observed, not inhabited. Only priests and select individuals were allowed to enter temples. The temple was the Greeks' major contribution to architecture during this time period. And the temple itself originated as a house of the gods, and it was based on the traditional Mycenaean houses, the megaron, that we saw earlier. Early temples were probably built out of wood, and gradually over time they transitioned to stone, which is obviously a much more permanent construction type. This temple represents the height of Doric architecture. It's a monumental sculpture set into the landscape. It's structurally expressive and solid, and it's unified. Oftentimes we'll see that Greek architecture is located with key alignments to the landscape. In this case, the conical hills that you see in the background determine the alignment of the temple. These hills were seen as symbols of Hera, the earth goddess. And the hill determines the association with Hera, as well as the location and orientation of the temple within the town of Paestum. In fact, the temple itself is misaligned with everything else in the town, specifically to achieve this alignment with an element in the landscape that was seen as sacred. This is a typical temple form. It evolved from the Mycenaean megaron and became a house for gods. The proportions define the order. For example, the diameter of the column defines the height of the column. So if we look at this in terms of form, site, and meaning, this is a typical Doric temple. It's orthogonal. It's made out of limestone. It would have had a traditional timber roof. In terms of site, it's located in Paestum in Italy, which was a colonial Greek city, and it's aligned with a sacred mountain. In terms of meaning, it's associated with Hera, the Earth Mother. The alignment of the temple is important, and it's also Doric, which represents solidity. It's also typical of all Greek architecture, meant to stand as a sculptural object that's meant to be observed. You're to experience Greek architecture by looking at its sculptural beauty, not by inhabiting its spaces. It's important for us to understand the components of a typical Greek temple, because we'll see these forms literally repeated for the next 2,000 years within architecture. In fact, we still use these forms today for buildings that we deem to have a democratic or cultural significance. The image on the upper right is that of the U.S. Supreme Court. In terms of the temple components, at the top of a typical Greek temple you would have the triangulated roof form known as the pediment. Below that you would have the entablature, which is the horizontal. The entablature would often have relief sculptures. Below that, obviously, you'd have the columns. The columns have three parts: the capital, which is the top, the shaft itself, and the base. Sometimes there would be a pedestal below that. Greek architecture is defined by proportional systems. These were later quantified in the Renaissance, but the proportions of a Greek temple are often governed by the diameter of the columns themselves. There's a relationship between the column diameter to the column height, the column diameter to the spacing between. Greek columns also have something called entasis. You might be able to see this best in the image of the Temple of Poseidon at the bottom. Entasis is a slight change in the column diameter, a slight flaring out of the column over its height. You can compare entasis to that of a muscle being flexed. It visually expresses the physical load that's being carried by the column from the pediment and the entablature above. Greek columns are also fluted, meaning they have these vertical striations carved into them. The flutes were there to enhance the sense of volume by giving the column shadows. The overall height and the spacing of the columns were adjusted regionally in Greek architecture, but it was of particular importance that there be a mathematical and proportional relationship between the column diameter, the column height, and the spacing of the columns. When we're talking about Greek architecture, we often talk about the Greek orders. And the origin of the orders are debated, but some believe that they may have evolved from traditional detailing techniques that were made out of wood construction, that were later translated into stone. When we talk about the Greek orders, we're particularly talking about the column capital. The Doric order was the first Greek order to be developed. It's short and squat, stable and strong. There's usually no base. It's the simplest column form. It's often believed to have the proportions of a man, and it originated on the Greek mainland. The second Greek order that was developed is called Ionic. Ionic is lighter and more slender. It has volute capitals, which look like rolled scrolls, or perhaps the curls of a woman's hair. It's often said to have the proportions of a woman, and it originated in the islands of the Aegean. The last Greek order, and the most complex to be developed, is the Corinthian. The Corinthian column is very slender. It has a very ornate capital, which is defined by the use of acanthus leaves. And it was rarely used on the Greek mainland itself. So if you remember back to the slide of the Temple of Poseidon at Paestum, we talked about the Temple of Poseidon being a Doric temple, which means that it used the Doric order as its column type. The diagram on the left shows the proportional ordering systems that governed the Greek columns. You can see that the Doric column is the shortest and most squat, and the Corinthian column on the right is the tallest and most slender, and the proportional relationships between the column diameter and the column height. This was a diagram that was created during the Renaissance, so this is really a Renaissance view of what the Greek order rules were. The reality is that the column orders weren't this strict in terms of their exact proportional relationships. But you do get a sense for their overall kind of proportional relationships between each other. Doric was the most squat and shortest, and Corinthian was the tall and slender column. The pedestals that you'll see in this diagram were purely a Renaissance addition some 1500 years after Greek architecture. You won't find pedestals in traditional Greek architecture. But it does give you a sense for the Renaissance view of what the proportional rules were governing the Greek orders. What we really find in real life is there's a little bit of subtle variation between Greek temples throughout Greek history. The Roman architect Marco Vitruvius was known for describing the Greek orders as containing human characteristics. Vitruvius said that the Doric order furnished the proportions of a man's body and was symbolic of strength and the beauty of man. Vitruvius thought that the Ionic order represents feminine slenderness, even complete with the curling hair on top. The Ionic order represents the feminine grace and beauty. Even the 20th century architect Le Corbusier is quoted as having said, "There was a breath of tenderness, and Ionic was born." The Corinthian order, according to Vitruvius, imitated the slight figure of a maiden or a young woman, and admits a more graceful effect in its ornamentation. This idea that the columns were human-like or humanistic is an important part of Greek architecture. One of the new forms of civic architecture created by the Greeks is that of the theater. We can see here the theater of Epidaurus from the 4th century BC. Drama productions originally began as religious rituals in ancient Greece, and going to the theater was a celebration of community spirit. Plays contributed to the political education, as well as being forms of entertainment. So going to the theater was not like we might think of it today as being purely a source of entertainment. You can also see here that geography and the landscape has an important impact on the Greek theater. Greek theaters were carved into the landscape. The stage itself would often have a very low backdrop, and so from the theater you'd have views not only of the performance, but of the natural landscape in the background. And again, this alignment of Greek architecture with elements in the landscape that were seen as almost sacred is important. In the Greek theater, the stage areas move slightly forward, so the seating kind of wraps around the stage, making the Greek amphitheater slightly more than a half circle. At the theater you'd see poetic, theatrical, musical performances, which were often more than simply entertainment. They were oftentimes a celebration of religious and civic beliefs. From their seats, the spectators took part not only in the performance, but they also experienced the surrounding landscape. And the theater was a place where the whole visible universe of man and nature would come together in one single order. With a new form of government, an early version of democracy, we begin to see new forms of civic or public architecture. A good example of this can be found in the agora in ancient Athens. The agora was really a civic center. It's roughly rectangular in shape. It was the political, commercial, administrative, and social center of Athens. It contains the stoa, which is a marketplace, as well as the bouleuterion, which is the seat of government. In the bouleuterion complex, we see two different types of spaces. One is the bouleuterion space. The population of ancient Greece was divided into 10 tribes, and each tribe would get to select 50 bouleutai advisors. And so when you have a government based on the input of people, an early form of democracy, and you have 50 advisors being sent from 10 tribes, you need new types of spaces to house these functions. The bouleuterion itself, the two images on the bottom, were really the meeting chamber for the representatives of this early form of democracy. In some ways you can look at this as an equivalent of our House of Representatives. Also part of the bouleuterion complex is the tholos, which was a 60-foot diameter circular space, kind of an all-purpose space where the bouleutai would meet and have meals. What you can see by these new forms of architecture, they illustrate the Greek design principle that to be beautiful, a form must do its job well, and each of these is a specific response to the needs of the space. It also illustrates these new forms of architecture that are originating out of the fact that this new type of government demands spaces that didn't exist before in history. Another part of the Greek agora would be that of the stoa, and in these images you can see the stoa of Attalus. The stoa would have had both interior spaces as well as exterior porch-like spaces, and essentially the stoa is a marketplace. There would have been a variety of uses that would have occurred within the stoa, but basically these would have been shops and meeting places. So the stoa, along with the bouleuterion, really make up the Greek agora. And if we look at the agora in terms of form, site, and meaning, in terms of form, this is the civic complex of ancient Athens. It's loosely rectangular in shape. All of the designs within the agora are functionally organized. In other words, the shape and form of the buildings come directly out of the type of functions that occur within them. And they would have been built out of stone with traditional timber and tile roofs. In terms of site, the agora, as well as the stoa of Attalus, is located at the base of the Acropolis in ancient Athens, and it really was the center of civic life. In terms of meaning, there's this association with civic or public life, which is partially coming out of a new form of government that's demanding new types of governmental spaces, as well as being representative of the ideas of a human-centered worldview. Finally, we can't talk about Greek architecture without talking about the Acropolis and the many beautiful Greek temples that happen to be found here. This really is probably the most important site in the history of Western architecture. The Acropolis itself is really the heart of Athens, both figuratively and literally. It's located on the high rocky outcropping in the center of the city and surrounded by outlying mountains. It's the site of the annual ritual and processional to honor the patron goddess of Athens, Athena. Originally, the Acropolis would have been a fortified citadel, like we found in Mycenae. But the classical Acropolis, as we see here, was begun by Pericles, the statesman. It's a religious complex, or a religious center, with temples to the goddess Athena, Athena Nike, Athena Parthenos. The buildings themselves would have been made out of stone and marble, and would have had timber and tile roofs. And it's located in this visually stunning location on the center of a rocky plateau in the middle of the city of Athens, ringed by mountains. And many of the temples would have been aligned with key features in the landscape. So the temples themselves have sacred alignments with landscape features in the mountains beyond. So the Pan-Athenaic festival is the all-Athenian festival. It's Athens' most important festival, and all of the inhabitants of the city would take part in this. It's believed to be an observance of Athena's birthday, and it honored the goddess as the city's patron divinity, Athena Polias, or Athena of the city. The procession is the main feature of this celebration, and the frieze that runs around the inner chamber of the Parthenon is generally believed to represent this Pan-Athenaic procession. So the Pan-Athenaic procession would work like this. The population would assemble before dawn at the gate to the city in the northern sector of the city, and then they would proceed on the Pan-Athenaic way through the Agora. The image on the lower right shows this, the Pan-Athenaic way passing through the Agora. The Stoa of Attalus is the building on the left, and ultimately proceeding to the Acropolis in the background. They would have then stopped at the Areopagus, which was a religious site, stopped in front of the temple of Athena Nike, proceeded next onto the Propylaea, or the gateway. Only Athenian citizens were allowed to pass through the Propylaea and enter the Acropolis itself. The procession would then pass the Parthenon and ultimately stop at the Erechtheum. And we'll look at all these buildings, kind of in the sequence that they would have been experienced on the Pan-Athenaic procession in the next several slides. In the upper left of this slide, you'll see the plan of the entire Acropolis. And at first glance, the Acropolis might seem like the site plan itself, or the plan of the buildings, is almost kind of arbitrary and haphazard. But this isn't the case. In ancient Greece, before a temple was constructed, an altar was placed on the site in the ideal position from which the whole sacred landscape could be grasped. In other words, the positioning of the temples on top of the Acropolis have a distinct relationship with the natural landscape and the views of the surrounding areas beyond. Again, it's one of the key aspects of Greek architecture that we've discussed, that Greek architecture often has significant alignments with the landscape beyond. This is different than the kind of rigid geometric compositions that we saw in ancient Egypt, for example. In terms of entering the Acropolis, the first building you come to is the Propylaea. The Propylaea is really the ceremonial entrance or gateway to the entire temple complex on top of the Acropolis. As you would have walked up the steps towards the Propylaea, you can also see the temple of Athena Nike, located on the upper right portion of the upper right image. But the Propylaea would have been really a magnificent doorway to what is the Acropolis. You can imagine coming up this hill, being greeted by this classical Greek temple, and then entering and walking through the threshold onto the Acropolis plateau beyond. As you make your way up the stairs toward the Propylaea, or entrance to the Acropolis proper, up to your upper right you'll see the Temple of Athena Nike, sitting on this podium, perched out over the landscape. The image on the right is what it would look like from the stairs below, looking up towards the Temple of Athena Nike before you have reached the Propylaea. And the image on the left shows what it's like once you've reached the plateau of the Acropolis, looking back towards the Temple of Athena Nike. The Temple of Athena Nike dates from 427 BCE. It's a classical Greek Ionic temple. It's often referred to as the jewel of the Acropolis. It's small but elegant, and it was built to commemorate the Greek victory over the Persians. It has 4 Ionic columns which face outward toward the landscape. The Erechtheion was the last building built on the Acropolis complex, and it's also the most unusual. It's a temple that houses shrines to a variety of gods, and it sits on the edge of a drop in the rock and features a multi-level plan. The most unusual aspect of this temple, however, is the Porch of the Maidens, or the Caryatids. These 6 columns, formed as maidens with crowns on their head, as the capitals to the columns, is probably the most original aspect of this structure. It's also the most literal example that we see in ancient Greek architecture of column forms taking on anthropomorphic or human-like characteristics. The Caryatids, or the Porch of the Maidens, is really the most unusual as well as most stunning aspect of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis. And here we also see this most literal example of the ancient Greeks using anthropomorphic or human-like forms to become columns in their architecture. You have the woman with her hair and crown on her head becoming the column capital, literally. Her dress with the vertical striations are, symbolic of the flutes on the columns. It's probably the most literal example we have of evidence that Greek architecture and Greek column forms were anthropomorphic or human-like in nature. The Caryatids have been copied literally around the world throughout history. We even have our own example of the Porch of the Maidens here in Chicago that can be found at the Museum of Science and Industry. Finally, the most important building on the Acropolis, one of the most important buildings in architectural history, is the Parthenon, an image probably you all recognize. The Parthenon replaced an earlier temple on the same site, and it's dedicated to the goddess of war, Athena Parthenos. And even in antiquity, the Parthenon was recognized as a special achievement. Parthenon really became a symbol of the clarity and the precision of ancient Greek architecture. Parthenon is unusual for several reasons. First, its size is larger than a traditional Greek temple. And second, it has a double-chambered interior, which was also unusual for Greek temples. What makes the Parthenon special, though, is the precision of its construction and the subtle visual refinements. Parthenon was constructed with a dry masonry system, so there's no mortar used. Blocks of marble are stacked together with gravity and, in some cases, wooden pins and clamps. The entire building itself is governed by a proportional system of 4 to 9. The plan is the proportion of 4 to 9. The facade is this proportion. The diameter of the column and the space between is also this proportional system. Many people throughout history believe that the beauty of the Parthenon is in the relationship of its proportions to that of the golden section. And throughout history, this ratio of length to width of rectangles of about 1 to 1.61 which is known as the golden ratio or the golden mean, sometimes called the golden section, has been considered to be one of the most pleasing proportions to the eye. It's kind of this magic number that's found in a number of examples throughout nature, as well as in the proportions of the facade of the Parthenon. And it's really these subtle refinements, which many people believe gives the Parthenon its outstanding sense of beauty. What's most remarkable to me about the Parthenon, as well as other Greek temples, is the subtle visual refinements that the builders went through to achieve perfection. The Greeks designed their temples, and I quote, "with regard to that which the eye deceives us." And so the Parthenon itself gives us this impression that everything is absolutely perfect and straight and flat. But the reality is that nothing in the Parthenon is straight. These diagrams are exaggerated to give you a sense, but absolutely everything in the Parthenon has been optically refined and curved. All the pieces of this building are constructed in a way to counteract the way we perceive objects. The Greeks understood how our eyes work, and they refined their buildings with these subtle optical refinements so that when we view it, it will look perfect. For example, the end columns, which you can see on the slide on the lower right, are thicker than the others to give it weight to set against the backdrop of the sky. And they're also about 2 feet closer to the other columns than all of the middle columns. All the straight lines in the Parthenon are actually curved. The columns enlarge as they rise, the base steps are curved, even the base or the floor is curved itself, so that when we look at it, our eye views it as perfect. Think about the time and energy it took Greek builders to come in and make these subtle, barely perceptible visual refinements, all with the goal of trying to achieve this ideal sense of perfect beauty. If you remember, one of the themes of this class is the idea that we build the way we think. In other words, you can see what a culture or a society or a time period values through the things that they invest their time and energy in creating. And you can see this illustrated really perfectly in Greek architecture. Greek architecture illustrates the Greek pursuit of the ideal in perfect balance. Greek architecture was meant to be viewed as a beautiful sculpture set within the landscape. It was precisely optically refined so that when we look at a Greek temple, our eye perceives it to be perfect. Remember, the Greeks sought immortality through the perfection of human deeds. And the Parthenon itself, in hard marble, really serves as proof that the ideal can be realized through human action. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, the course of Western architecture has really been dominated by the influence of the achievements of the ancient Greeks. When we talk about humanism, when we use the term classical, we're really referring back to the ideas and achievements that were developed in ancient Greek culture. It really is the most influential time period in the course of Western architecture. And the Acropolis and the Parthenon are one of the most important places in the history of Western architecture. We'll see these same themes and these same forms repeated for the next 2,000 years throughout history as we talk about various cultures within this course. And if you ever have the opportunity to visit Athens, to set foot on the Acropolis, view the Parthenon, I would encourage you to do so. It really is one of the most magical places in terms of architectural history in the world.